Okay. So hello everyone. Very good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, Aditya. Am I audible, Aditya, or is it got hung up?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, all right. So without further delay, first of all, happy Teachers Day, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm sure we should wish each other. We all are teachers, learners together.
So good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today for this session. It is both a privilege and an honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Smita Sahgal of the Department of History, Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. A scholar of remarkable depth and range, Professor Sahgal has devoted her academic life to exploring questions that lie at the very heart of historical inquiry, questions of society, culture, religion, and gender in early and medieval India. Educated at the University of Delhi, where she earned her MA, MPhil, and PhD, Professor Sahgal has steadily built a reputation as a historian whose work moves beyond surface readings of text to uncover the layered complexities of Indian traditions. Her MPhil research on the spread of Jainism in ancient India laid the groundwork for a lifelong engagement with the dynamics of religion, ethics, and social structure. Over the years, she has widened her academic horizon, even earning a postgraduate diploma and a master's degree in theology, which adds further depth to her interpretations of early Indian texts and their living traditions. Professor Sahgal has published widely in the field of gender studies within Indian history. Her monograph, Niyoga, Alternative Mechanism of Lineage Perpetuation, a Social Historical Inquiry 2017, remains a landmark in examining the gendered complexities of labour practices in early India. She has also co-authored Teaching History 2013, a book that reflects her commitment to pedagogy and the rethinking of historical education in our times. In addition to these, her chapters and articles, whether on the agency of women in the Dharmashastras, the silenced voices of women in Puranic traditions, or the contested constructions of masculinity in the Mahabharata, have contributed immensely in the field. She has also been a prominent participant of leading forums such as the Indian History Congress and the Delhi History Congress, where her work on the recalibration of Kshatriya masculinity in the Shanti Parva has drawn wide scholarly attention. Her scholarship is marked by a deep engagement with texts, but also by a refusal to treat them as static repositories of meaning. Instead, she reads them against the grain, attentive to the silences, the contestations, and the ruptures that often escape traditional historiography. It is precisely this method of historical reading that makes her lecture today especially significant. The theme she'll be addressing today is how to read gender in a historical context. Sulabha-Janaka exchange in the Moksha Dharma of the Mahabharata opens up a vital space of conversation. This dialogue, embedded in the Moksha Dharma section of Mahabharata, is not only a philosophical dialogue, but also a moment that foregrounds the negotiation of gendered identities within the larger framework of Dharma, renunciation, and kingship. Professor Seigel's reading promises to illuminate how gender operates as both a lens and a lived reality in early Indian texts, and how historical methodology allow us to retrieve these nuances. Our lecture today will invite us to think carefully about how gender is inscribed, contested, and reinterpreted in early traditions that continue to shape cultural consciousness. At a time when questions of gender remain central to both scholarly and public debate, this exploration of the dialogue is not only timely but also deeply instructive, bridging the concerns of ancient texts with the critical methodologies of contemporary historical research. It is with great anticipation that we now turn to Professor Sahgal, whose erudition and insight will guide us through this fascinating terrain. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya. Uh, I really hope that I am audible to everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me for this fantastic initiative that you have taken. But more than that, Aditya, I never heard such a longish introduction to myself, and I'm in a different world altogether. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. Uh, I'm as Aditya has just informed us that I'm going to talk about how to read gender in a historical text, which is primarily about Sulabha-Janaka exchange. And I'm hoping, Aditya, if I'm true, I am actually addressing students. The bulk of the population is students. Is that true?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, because then I can afford to talk at relatively simpler level, elementary level. But if there are seniors around, please help me also whenever the questions come. Because what I'm going to talk about is how to read gender in a historical text, which basically deals with a kind of research methodology. Many of you may be from Delhi University and probably are studying your research methodology paper this semester or may have studied earlier. Gender is a paper that had been introduced 8 years back, and I have got an opportunity to teach it. So I think whatever I'm going to speak today comes out of my experience of teaching a kind of a methodology that I have evolved myself. At the same time, I'm also concerned about the questions that come and would try and anticipate the queries that come while doing any kind of research. I come from the field of ancient India, so primarily, when if I look at gender, also it is from ancient India. But thankfully, the paper on gender has pushed me into looking at new forays in medieval and modern period as well. Now, before I start with the dialogue, there are a couple of preliminaries I want to familiarize you with. First of all, when I talk about reading a text, what is it that I mean? Reading a text, especially a historical text, in my opinion, is a craft. It's a skill. It requires transformation from being just a casual reader to an invested reader, rather becoming an interrogator. Now, friends, whenever you pick up even a book, a simple book on fiction, you would turn to the back flap and see what are the contents, and if they're engaging enough, you'll start reading it. Similarly, when you're doing reading of a historical text, you have to be invested, probably more invested and far more serious in this exercise because you have to now become a historical interrogator. You just don't have to be a passive reader. When you're reading a fiction and you find these are boring pages, you'll turn them and then go on to another page. But as a student of history and as a research student of history, what would be expected of you is to be very serious in this effort. And serious in this effort means, again, that you should have some kind of a framework in your mind before you start taking the exercise of reading text uh, in a very spirited way. For instance, you should first understand what is the purpose of reading. There has to be, anywhere and everywhere in the world, when anybody is writing, they're writing with an intent, with some purpose. And for us also, this becomes important, even if whether you're doing your historical, whether you're doing your methodological research or you're doing just a historical research, whatever it is, it'll add to your understanding of a larger research question. When I say what is the purpose behind writing of the text, let me just give you one example. Uh, Something like reading Jatak tales. Now, Jatak tales, which are written around, 3rd century BCE onwards in what we refer to as the post-Mauryan time, there was a purpose. It's a part of Kudak Nikai. There is an actual purpose of formulating what the Jataks as they were. The idea, and it's a part of the Buddhistic tradition, the idea was to familiarize the populace of Buddhist principles and also take up a kind of a moralistic stand in the given milieu. So each of the Jatak stories would end up with some kind of a meaning and a kind of message that had to be uh, transferred across. Now that really helps us because we get to know what the purpose is. We've been able to understand that. Then we go on, and if it is a gender reading, we are going on to look at other questions such as do we have evidence of gendered public voices? Gender, unfortunately, has got associated with women, but gender means men, women, alternative identities, how much voice they have. are they also answering some questions on gender equity or power relations? Well, I'll be talking about it in some kind of a detail a little later. But just at the moment, I just want you people to think about very basic questions about the about the text, the nature of the text, the genre of the text, even the language of the text. All these language of the text and the audience it has targeted. What kind of audience is it targeting? Is it the lay population? If we talk of the Vedic corpus, it's definitely not the lay population. It's the initiated very few. But if you're talking about, say, Ramayana, Mahabharata, it is definitely the lay population that is being taken into account. If we were to consider texts as, as the serial, your dramas, also as visual text, you would find that the kind of serials that come on television, the Saas Bahu serials also, there is a purpose behind it. There is some kind of a message that is being conveyed and some kind of a learning that is expected from here. And so whenever any text is being compiled for the future generations, we as students of history have to try and figure out what might have been the intention. So there are two things. What might have been the intention at the time when it was being composed and compiled, and if it has endured over years and years, how has it adapted itself to the new milieu and what relevance does it bring? I'm just trying to figure out the questions that there can be in my mind, also realizing simultaneously that any text would have limitations, and that depends on the genre of the text, the purpose of the text definitely contained. If I were to take the Vedic corpus as a historical text, I need to remember that the Vedas were written with a certain purpose. Most of the time, if you look at the Sahitas, these are prayers, Brahmanas, we all know, are explanatory texts. Then there are certain forest books, and finally come the Vedantic Upanishadic text. Now, there seems to be a purpose in the sense that there seems to be a target audience, very, very initiated target audience. And if you were to read Rig Samhita, something like Rig Samhita, believe it, friends, it's such a terse text to read because there are so many. I mean, I'm talking of only one of the versions that is there with us, the Shakala version. The assumption is that the people to whom you are reading out the mantras are familiar with it. So half the things can be told and half the things can be understood. So there is a limitation. And then culling historical material out of it may become very, very difficult. But sometimes the texts are written with the purpose of recording history, the Itihas Puran tradition. You have sections which is intended for that purpose itself. So we have to look at it. Who is writing at what time? What are the limitations? And within the limitations, how can we work things out? Now, coming to gender in a historical context, which requires a fairly nuanced and critical engagement and engagement of both the text and the context. Both the things have to be understood. It does not mean only, identifying, okay, in this particular story, these are the women, these are the men. And if I insist, these are the members of third gender. We are trying to uncover many other things. We have to look at the gender relations. We have to look at the existence of power relations, how these relations made sense in the society, who were the harbingers of the norms of that, or who brought those norms around, who did the norms benefit, and who are the subjects of it, and do we have the responses of the subjects also recorded, or sometimes we have to read between lines to get that. Sorry. Now, we have to primarily examine representations. Now, when we have to examine representations, one of the things that we see in the text is who is present. Obviously, I mean, again, men, women, human beings of diverse identities. But we also have to understand not only the people who are present in the text, but the people who are absent from the text. And then look at it whether their absence is deliberate, intentional, unintentional. And even if we look at the various characters within the text, we have to see how the text describes their bodies, their behavior, their dress, the spaces that they inhabit, the roles that they perform, can those be stereotypical roles? Or those roles are exceptions to the rule? In other words, the kind of characters that are created within the text, the figures that are there within the text, do they reinforce prevailing norms or challenge them? Let me just give you one example with which may not be directly connected to my work, but I think we all are familiar with it. You've all heard, I'm sure, of Razia Sultana. That is, we're talking of the 13th century, Delhi Sultanate. Now, the Razia Sultan became the Sultan. Probably she decided to become and was supported by the Delhi nobility. She was there for just 3.5 years. But then she was very disruptive for the larger milieu of the time. She had unveiled herself. She would ride an elephant. She would be there in the battle. She connected with the populace. She was out on the roads. Something that the old nobility found very difficult to digest. And what we then find is that Razia Sultan had to pay a price for it. Eventually, she was removed. She was probably killed after 3.5 years of her rule. But she remained in the memory of people, of the historiographers, more as a disruptor and somebody who surprised them. She came out of nowhere. So she was not there to reinforce the prevailing norms, but to challenge them. But in the whole discussion, when we start thinking from current day's lens, and I'm talking about 20th, 21st century, so one of the questions that we ask, of course, that she seemed to be a very brave woman of the time, and who at least tempted to administer the empire from herself without seeking too much of help from the old nobility. We also try to see from today's perspective, a feminist perspective, what did she do for the women folk? Well, we all know the answer is in the negative. She did not do anything for the women folk. The only thing, the very revealing thing that she did was that the institution of kingship, which was a very masculine institution, she stepped into that and she challenged the old patriarchal norms. To that an extent, her role was something that became unforgetful in subsequent centuries, whether you have Amir Khusro or Izami, Ibn Battuta, so many people, right even in the time of the Mughals, they're talking about this lady called the ruler called Razia Sultan. So she disrupted what was the prevailing norms of the day, and that is important for us to understand. Next, we also try to understand, even from seen from gender vantage, what is the language, what is the genre of the text, and of course, what is the language of the text. Genre is something, it could be prescripted like the Dharma Shastras are, it could be a narrative like the but if it is Dharmshastric literature, then of course we know the audience is actually limited. But if it is an epic or Puranic literature, it is meant for a larger crowd. But coming to this question of which language is it in? Now, many texts that I study, many texts, not all, but many texts that I study are in Sanskrit. But it is not as if they have emerged in Sanskrit in the first place. They are Sanskritized at some point in time, even something like Gatha Saptashati. You know about it. That's the text which is ascribed to Hal Satvana, first, second century CE text, which is written in Maharashtric Prakrit. It was first composed in Marathi. What would be the precursor of Marathi? But then gradually it was Sanskritized. It was Satsai earlier, and then it's called Gatha Saptashati, Sanskritized. जैसे ही संस्कृताइज हुआ उसका एक और मीनिंग निकलने लगा था मतलब there is somebody else who had already entered the thing. But if you were to look at a text that I'm teaching these days in the class to the fourth year students reading social relations, Mrichakatikam. It's a play which is ascribed to Shudrak somewhere around 3rd to 5th century CE. What we find very unique about it's a play, but it's not a natak, it's a prakaran, and that takes the Katodian into account. It is a play that has both the languages in it, Prakrit and Sanskrit. Of course, when you read the translation, it's all in English. But the difference is there, and that difference is a very telling difference. Because when women folk speak, that is, women to women, or women to slaves, or even men to, I mean, men, the husbands to women, the language used is Prakrit, assuming that they can't use Sanskrit. But when men of the elite class and the nobility speaks, the language used is Sanskrit. The language itself is so gendered, it creates a divide. And therefore, this particular character who's called Matre, who actually meets Vasantasena, the courtesan, for the first time in her Vaishnavas, is so surprised that she can speak chaste and fluent Sanskrit and that she is set apart from the rest. So the very fact that somebody can speak in Sanskrit and fluent Sanskrit, a woman speaking in Sanskrit, also indicates how men perceive it. Otherwise, language itself has become a form of divide. I mean, it's a gender divide that we can see. Of course, along with that, there are other issues that we take into account. Sexuality is, of course, so important. The issue of the difference between, the, say, the Kulavadu and the Vaishya or the Naika, Ganika, uh, the domestic role, the entry into public, so many things that we take into account when analyzing. When it comes to authorship, which is very important because authorship also decides, authorship and the historical setting for us is very important before we start reading the text. It's important because who is it ascribed to? Now, texts like the Mahabharata is ascribed to Ved Vyas, but we know that it could not have been written by one individual. It has evolved over centuries and centuries. And as I mean, it must be a story of the later Vedic period, but then as a popular culture, part of popular culture. And what includes popular culture? You have Gatha, you have Katha, you have Akhyans. Akhyans are the dramatized version. मतलब कहीं पर छोटा सा play हो रहा है, लोग देख रहे हैं. Part of oral culture, Narashansi. So धीरे धीरे करके ये जो pop, sorry, not pop, it's folk literature or popular literature that is there gets Sanskritized. There's a whole process, one second, whole process that is taken into account. So we also have to see who is the author. What is the background the author comes from? For instance, Mrijkatika that I'm talking about, it's an author very clearly, author who Shudrak, who is called a king, and we don't know who this king is because we don't get to know her territory. But in the Prastavana itself, we are told that he is a king. So we also know the background, and we also know that there are other rulers. You know, Harsh also wrote 3 plays. So there are people who are writing generally. Generally, it's Brahmins, but they can be Kshatriyas. At times, it can be Vaishyas also. Who is the author? What is the setting of the author? All that is important to understand because that definitely colors the production overall, whatever it is. The vantage gets decided from there. And so, if it is a gender vantage, and most of the time, most of the authors in the ancient time are men. Hardly any examples. Women must have played a role in as the transmitters of oral tradition, and as they're transmitting the oral tradition, there is every possibility that they have also added their own interpretation there. But in the final Sanskritized form, most of the time, that is 90% of the time, it is a male authorship. At least that becomes very, very obvious. And so they also then decide which female character to keep and which not. If somebody threatens their sensibilities, the individual can be sidelined. But we have to read, and so we also have to read the socio-political environment or milieu in which that particular text was being being composed. We take into account further the issues of power and labor also. So does the text talk about power? And power here, as we know today, and a gendered power we talk about, does not always seem to be the power between the authority and the populace, which is very, very natural. That may be the case here, but it could also be very dispersed power. Dispersed power we understand, which is not something which is so obvious, and yet somebody is able to exercise that kind of authority. So, can we trace that? I'm just asking a question. I may not have all answers all the time, depends on the text that we are reading. And then does it talk about labor issues? Because when we talk about who is the one who's actually putting in the labor, so we are looking at, of course, the peasants, looking at the artisans, we're looking at women and men both within that category, and also who is a very active agent in decision of power and labor relations, and who is the passive recipient of that, the transmitter of ideas as well. For understanding any text, actually, we can use a number of theoretical tools. We can use feminist theory, we can use queer theory, we can talk in terms of material, vantages from which, or a couple of, approaches together in order to understand deeper, the text deeper, which basically means that reading gender in a historical text should imply interrogating what it is said in the text and also how it is said. We all know when you're talking about history, these are two questions that are always there. Why did this happen and how did this happen? So same thing application would also come in this. I hope, friends, I have been able to give you a preface to my, what I'm going to talk about. I'll now come specifically to the Sulabha-Janaka exchange in the Moksha Dharma Parv of the Mahabharata. Now, yes, sir. This particular episode, if you were to even do a casual Google search, you'll know that this is seemingly something that comes within the domain of philosophy. It is an exchange, a philosophical conversation between a yogini who is called Sulabha and a philosopher king who is Janak. Janak, I must tell you, friends, was definitely a ruler of Mithila. But the name Janak often comes as a prototype for many kings. कुछ नाम होते ही हैं, वो जनक है तो इसके मतलब he is supposedly an evolved soul. And within the Mahabharata itself, we have so many references to Janak, and within the Shanti Parva, I came across at least 5 different kinds of references of Janak at different points in time. And sometimes they seem to be talking about the same story, sometimes a very different story. Now, this particular dialogue, of course, centers on self-knowledge, on renunciation, on the issue of moksha, liberation, dharma, the true nature of self. Yes, its primary purpose is without doubt very philosophical. But as a student of history, we know that we can read this particular text from different vantages: literary, philosophical, gender, bring in the issue of ethics, morality, and even politics, because it can be something that would be a part of a kind of a political advice or advice in political craft to Yudhishthir. So again, before we start the text, the very particular questions that we should confront, answer, number of questions, we need to know the placement of this particular episode within the larger matrix of Shanti Parv and the Mahabharata. We have to understand the time frame in which it was possibly composed, again, the authorship. All these things have to be taken into account before we come to the main narrative of it. So, friends, I just briefed you a little about the Mahabharata. As a text, Mahabharata, it is generally believed must have been in composition for over 800 years, from 4th century BC or to 4th century CE. But most of the scholars agree that the story of the kind of conflict between, cousins, Kauravas and Pandavas, this can be traced back to the later Vedic period, sometimes between 1000 and 500 BCE, which means that this was a story. Skirmishes are there all around, especially when your state society is evolving from a tribal setup as a state society is evolving from Janapadas and you're moving towards the Mahajanapadas. Skirmishes of all kinds would be there because we know the entire process involves the absorption of smaller units for the formation of a bigger political unit. So whether the battle happened or not, well, it's most likely it happened. There's no doubt about it. But it is not just the battle happening, but the recording of that battle and passing it out generation to generation, which is very important, the transmission of it. And we know that the Mahabharata itself talks about 3 different kinds of transmissions that happen. And all of us are familiar with the fact that there is the Jaya Sahita with smaller number of verses, which gets expanded to Bharat Samhita, and then finally to the Mahabharata, with 99,000 verses, huge corpus, which means that at every stage, annotations have happened. The text talks about it itself. So it's not something which is like a spurious addition to it later on. But somewhere around the 4th century CE, we assume that it was finally penned down or written down under the Guptas. And then it did not end there. Then there is a spread of the Mahabharata story all around east, west, south, everywhere, and many, many churnings come out of it. Not just that, the story of Mahabharata, some episodes of Mahabharata also find space in, say, the Puranic literature. So it's become a very popular thing. That again, the text that I'm teaching right now, Rich Katika, makes constant reference to various characters of the Mahabharata. So it was a part of the historical memory, cultural memory of the populace. So that's to talk about it. The time period we are concentrating on the Shanti Parva. Shanti Parva is book 12. The war has ended much earlier. Book 11th is the story of lament, the Sri Parv, where all the women, Gandhari sees what kind of destruction has happened, and there are other people, Yudhishthira and Kunti, with her. And then 12th is the one, after seeing so much destruction, Yudhishthira says no to ascension or throne. He's very clear. If this is what empire building comes to, I'd rather not get into it. He's a sort of an ascetic right from the beginning. That is something that is established in the early pages of the Mahabharata itself. He was like a thinker, a philosopher. And by the 12th episode, we know that he has decided right in the beginning that I will not ascend the throne. Now, the Shanti Parva is also divided into 3 books. It's a humongous text. It has one is the Raj Dharma Parva, second is Apad Dharma Parva, and third is Moksha Dharma Parva. And that is where we have the episode of Sulabha-Janaka. Now, coming back to when he had said no to ascension of throne, the entire family became worried. The brothers and Draupadi, and along with Krishna and Vyas, they decided to bring Yudhishthir to Bhishma, who's lying on a shaya of arrows. We know that he could choose the time of his death, and then tell him that you ask all kinds of questions that you have. You'll get the answer and then decide whether you want to ascend or not. So the 3 parvas that we have, Rajadharma, Apadharma, and Moksha Dharma, actually are just based on a dialogic exchange between Yudhishthir and Bhishma. But Bhishma, in order to explain numerous points to him, brings in a number of udaharans on short stories, various kind of stories, upakhyans and all, in order to explain a point to him, that a king should rule and he should rule in this way. And all the time we find Yudhishthira is very worried about the fact that if he enters, the political life again, he would stray away from the primary purpose of his existence. And for him, the primary purpose of the existence is spiritual liberation. Moksha Dharma is actually a text discussing that. And so one of the ways in which, Bhishma is trying to explain his point to Yudhishthir is by using the stories and tales of King Janak. So Janaka appears a number of times in the text. Now in 171, 12th is the book, 171, Janak is mentioned as a king who is fairly detached. Okay, he remains remarkably calm and composed as his city. He's the ruler of Videha or Mithila. The city is burning. But he is very calm and he remarks, what does he say? Oh, my possessions are infinite, yet nothing truly belongs to me. Even as Mithila is engulfed in flames, none of my valuables are being consumed. So what he is basically doing is he is feeling the idea that he has attained a degree of detachment or vairagya. And it does not matter. He says, even if there's a huge empire, how does it matter? It actually doesn't belong to me. I'm not a possessor of it. And he has a sense of, blessedness. And obviously the idea here was to tell Yudhishthir that if Janak could do it, so could you. Now, interestingly, Janak's, as I say, reference does not come in here. There are so many other questions that Yudhishthir keeps asking. And one of the questions that he asks a little later in the text, this is 171, and the other one, Sulabha-Janaka episode, comes in 308. Janak asks, Yudhishthir asks of Bhishma, he's keen to know of instances when men who remained householders could attain moksha. Now, in terms of philosophy, friends, at this point in time, and this is a text which is written, sorry, I did not tell you the time period, it's the postmodern time. 2nd century to 3rd century CE is the time of intellectual ferment all around. And these two books, both Shanti Parva and Anushasan Parva, considered to be books of that time. So many philosophical, as I say, churning is around. The character of Yudhishthir is shown to be asking very deep questions time and again. So one of the questions that he asks once again to uh, Bhishma, Yudhishthir is asking is, tell me the ways in which the sthul and sukshma sharira could rid itself of egotism to attain liberation. So sthul is the body, the physical body. Sukshma is the subtle body, right? So how does one get, and before that, the importance of to be free of ego and all has already been discussed. So he says that tell me the way how we can do it, and whether in a householder stage I can do it. That's when Bhishma says, okay, I'm going to tell you this particular story and listen to me very carefully. This is the story of Janak and Sulabha. Now, from my point of view, because when I had started reading it, it's a story that has been anatomized by many scholars earlier. But I read it as a part of my own research on masculinity studies. And I was interested in seeing whether a soul as evolved as King Janak, uh, how would his masculinity be judged? Whether somebody who had reached the stage of vairagya and prided about it, was it really that, or whether his ego could be punctured? So, he has asked this particular question, and the Sulabha story starts coming up. Then Sulabha, Janak is a philosopher king, and Sulabha is a female ascetic, whom actually Janak mistakes as a Brahmin woman, who was intent on puncturing Janak's claim of detachment. So what it is, she gets to know about it, that there is a ruler who prides in the fact that I've attained vairagya. Kuch bhi mera nahi hai. Jal raha hai to jalne do. Mera kuch bhi nahi hai. So she thinks, let me test him. And through the yogic parts, we don't know where she is, but through the yogic parts, she first turns into a very beautiful woman. And then she flies over to Vidya, reaches Mithila, and she stands outside the gates of Mithila. Uh, the interesting part was that, King always said that even if I'm ruling, I'm interested in knowing about more about philosophy, and that he would enter into Shastrat with all evolved souls around. So general trend was that in the evening, those people would come, he would sit down, he would actually welcome them, feed them, and towards evening and night, they would have discussions on various philosophical issues. So once when he spots that there is a beautiful woman standing there, he's very curious, and he invites her. Then obviously the welcome is done. And after that, the decision is that let's have a discussion, philosophical discussion. So imagine khana pina kha liya hai, both of them are sitting like this. Janak on one side and Sulabha on the other side. Now, what Sulabha does it, she looks straight into his eyes, very deeply into his eyes, and with the yogic power enters his consciousness. What we may refer to as something like hypnotism, Vashikaran. She does that, and it's almost like she bounds him with the rays of her eyes. Now, Janak, who is also an evolved soul, understands her actions. And in fact, at this particular stage, he finds her very naughty, and but he seemingly understood that she's trying to examine him at some level. But both, this is a very peaceful state at this time. What I mean by peaceful state is once you have entered, or the assumption is entered another person's consciousness, you see that individual without the worldly wrappings around him. In the sense that the king is not seen as a king, and a yogini is not as yogini, but you actually see the bare soul. That was the whole idea. And both of them can see each other and talk to each other without talking. So what it is, they're sitting together, they're absolutely quiet. She has entered his mind, and everything is happening in his head. So Sulabha has done that. Janak seemingly has understood Sulabha, but he is quite taken in by her very beautiful appearance. So what he does is, first of all, he introduces himself. He tells, "I am the king of Mithila." He talks about generally, I believe in philosophical discourses. I need to talk to other people. Then he says, "I have myself studied Sankhya philosophy, Panchashikha strain of philosophy." After he's introduced himself, this is the first part of the dialogue where he's continuously talking. Then he says, he asks her very penetrating questions after he's introduced. And at the time, he thinks that he can bring her under control. So his initial questions are, who are you and whose are you? Where do you come from? These are the three questions that he puts across. And then she keeps smiling, doesn't say much, and he starts getting very jittery inside. And it feels that she's trying to woo him, and says that in literature, the first stage of falling in love is when two people's eyes meet. That is how you become sexually attracted to each other. We have seen it in that, I think, Ramayana, if you Ramanand Sagar's Ramayana, if you had seen, there was a very interesting scene where before the marriage between Ram and Sita takes place, they accidentally meet in a park or a garden, and they look at each other. And the director actually focuses on the eyes, because the eyes and the look is what is very telling, and it's supposed to be the beginning of the love. Now, so he's saying, "What are you doing?" He asks him, why are you looking so intently at me? And then gets a little angry, and he says, "You're doing something wrong." He accuses Sulabha of seizing hold of him, which is parigraha. Now, Janak explains that a yogi felt, if a yogi felt calm, a sense of calm, he was not a genuine, or he or she is not a genuine renouncer, and says, "I think you are dushta. It is you're wicked. You are trying to attempt a union of nectar and poison," which is funny because he thinks that he's the nectar and she's the poison. And continuously tells her, "Do not touch me. Do not touch me. Follow your own prescriptions. You are trying to mix the social order." And overall, Sulabha keeps on looking at him very, very intently, very much in the mind. And what we find is that Janak starts getting nervous more and more. Aditya, if I am overshooting the time, tell me. I'll try and. Am I overshooting the time?
No, ma'am, you may continue.
I can continue. Wherever it is, just give me a signal. It would be
Sure.
better than I'll try and compress my. So he got more very nervous, and then he started saying, I quote, "You ought not to conceal from me anything that is hidden here, whether you have done this as your own undertaking, or whether you have concealed in a disguise. You have done it on behalf of another king. You ought not to conceal the truth from me." So obviously, one hunch that he had was that she was a spy. So he says that now I can also read your mind. So you better not hide things. And you ought truthfully to declare the ethnic group of your birth, jati. Huh? Your learning, your way of life, your state of mind, your nature, the objective in approaching me is getting more and more unsettled. And towards the end of the dialogue, his part of the dialogue, he's becoming a little rude, he's becoming a little harsh. I've cut down a lot in between. It's a huge dialogue, but I've just tried to give you the essence of that. So in the first part, it is just him speaking, and Sulabha is continuing to look at him very intently. Now comes Sulabha's response. Now, what was very interesting and which I've taken down here is what authors are writing there. You know what, again in quotes, this is from 12308.76. Sulabha was unshaken as the king lectured her with these unpleasant and inappropriate statements that made him ill. And then the authors continue. When the king had finished speaking, the lovely Sulabha began to make an even lovelier speech. So this is something which is there in the text, not my own making. So kind of a pronouncement in favor of Sulabha has started coming. The first thing that she does, Sulabha, is to give him, that is Janak, a lesson in rhetoric. What does she say? I'm going to tell you the highest truth, king, and I shall speak to you with pertinent meaning and coherence. I will not say too much, and I will not speak coarsely, not unclearly, will not use too many heavy syllables, nor say anything that starts to depart from the subject, nor anything untrue or unrefined, nor any words incorrect or harsh, nothing outrageous. I will not say anything extra, nor will I say anything unwarranted. That's the long dialogue that she has. So obviously, when she states that, friends, she has told Janak what he had done, how his speech was coarse, how his speech was unclear, how he was getting distracted from the topic. And there she says, I'll tell you, I'm going to respond very well. And I'm going to tell you what I think of it. So, first thing that she very clearly says is that you're mistaking the union that is there in our heads as sexual. It is only an intellectual communion. Now, we can make out that Sulabha is a very learned person. Uh, she doesn't say that I am, a knower of Sankhya philosophy, but we can make out from her dialogues, which will come later on, that she knows. She even is aware of Buddhism. So many strains of philosophy she seems to be aware of, and some of when she starts a systematic demolition of Janak's perception, they are reminiscent of aspects of Buddhist teachings like anatta, pattachit samutpad, and she starts answering. She says, let me come to your first question. You asked me, who are you? Now, this question lacks concrete answer, and it stems from an inadequate understanding of individuals' fundamental nature, as there is no permanent you or I. The whole Buddhistic philosophy of constant transition. She then goes on to talk about the manifested and the unmanifested nature of soul, also the process of birth from an embryo that turns in that embryo that becomes embryo because the merging of blood and semen, and then is transformed into a child, and the child in a young man, and then the old man. So basically, she's referring to the transient nature of being, and she says, "You don't know who you are. How can you ask me who I am?" Then she also accuses Janak of the statement that she had attempted to mix social orders. The king had assumed that she was a Brahmin, and so he asked her to follow your own scriptures, as Brahmin scriptures or that of a Sri Dharma, and that he was a Kshatriya man. But she was extremely critical of this assumption, and she says, again, quote, there is no mixing of social order in the loveless union of the one who is free and the other one who is free, because the soul is single and separate. And then says, basically what she says, if we are both are free and we are emancipated, where is the question of merging? There is no question of merging. And king, I'm not higher in order than you by birth, nor am I a Vaishya, nor a lower sort of woman. I am of the same order as king, a woman of clean birth and chaste. So she, without using the word Kshatriya, she said that she is also a Kshatriya, and he was wrong in his assumptions. She knows that he was trying to think, who does she belong to? Who is the husband? Who's the male in her life? And she says, since there was no husband suitable to me, I was trained in the rules of gaining absolute freedom. So all alone, I live according to the hermit's way. So I'm basically a sadhvi, a yogini. Then she contends Janak's argument that he's totally free, because that's an argument that he's been making in the first half of the dialogue. Then she says, as a king, you were definitely influenced by dualities. The term that she uses is dvandavas. That is what shapes your judgments. I, on the other hand, have no attachment to my own body. How could I be attached to anybody else's? You should not say such a thing about someone like me who is free. So she's proved, or she's trying to prove, that I am free and you are not. And why are you not free? You keep on saying that you are free, and you have overcome the bonds that fetter you, but you still seem to be attached to things like parasol and throne, and you're dependent on your council of ministers and so on. How are you free? There is parasol and all these are royal insignia. You are not free, while I am free. So, what she was doing is, in this theological debate with Jana, she was effectively challenging him on couple of points. First of all, the intellectual capabilities. Who has it? You think that you have it, a woman can't have it? She has challenged him on that. But and also told that if you know Sankhya philosophy, so do I. She doesn't say that I am a gyata of Sankhya philosophy, but she answers in the same vocabulary, in the same format that he is used, and then what she is trying to say, directly or indirectly, is that, king, you would be free only if you take sannyasa. Nivritti marg, not pravritti marg. As a householder, you would not be able to to free yourself. I could free myself because I've moved away from everything. Remember, we have renunciatory traditions at this time that are becoming very pervasive: Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivikas, and so on. So there is a hint in her estimate, and hint that those are far more relevant for emancipation than the part of the householder. And interestingly, this is an argument brought by the authors of the you know tradition. Now, what is happening is that while this is going on, he has become extremely jittery, and then he snaps at her, says, "Just leave my body, just leave my body." So she smiles and says, "I will not. I have come to, there is a rule that we have amongst the renouncers, that we stop over in an empty house at night and we rest there, and in the morning we go. And I'll do the same thing. I will be there in your head. I have not touched you. Basically, she says, I have not touched you with my hand, my feet, my leg, my body. I have not touched you, but I'll continue to stay in your head through the night. In the morning, I'll leave you. And which basically means, if you and I were to watch them, they both would be sitting still like this. She just did not let him move. Just did not, because she had that kind of yogic magical person. And she made her argument very clear that she has not done anything wrong. She has not done anything that seemed to violate dignity of any kind. And she does this. The king is quiet. Keeps sitting like this. Next day in the morning, she leaves the body, and that's when he becomes free. And the episode ends. The interesting part is the authors are very happy to end the episode, while you and I would have thought कि अब कोई statement आएगा जिसमें बताया जाएगा कि उस lady की कोई गलती थी, ऐसा कुछ नहीं हुआ, बंद कर दिया वो बंद कर दिया गया. And so we as readers are left with a litany of questions. क्या हुआ ये? I then tried to understand that. I must have read this text at least 3 times to understand it, because it is terse, it's philosophical and terse, and there is hidden meaning in that. I tried to look at it from the vantage of gender, social norms, Bhishma's response, and also larger power context. So the first question that came to my mind was that, did Sulabha really challenge patriarchal expectations of the day by engaging a king in a philosophical dialogue? Yes, the answer is that. Clearly, she comes with the intention and she succeeds in that. And the authors give her full points on that. Is Sullivan's asceticism a rejection of socially prescribed roles for women? To a large extent, yes, it is. She has refused to get married because she thought that nobody was worthy of. So, for a woman to say that nobody was worthy in a time and age when the only option left for women was to get married, this seems to be the rejection of a prescribed norm. How does Janak, the man, as a man, not as a king, respond to Sulabha, who is an ascetic? He's completely unnerved. He's actually unnerved. Initially, thinks that he can demolish, but through the dialogue, we realize that he doesn't get the last word. The last word is given to Sulabha. Question that also comes in the mind was that would Janak have responded differently if she were a male interlocutor? If instead of being a woman, she was a man, would his responses be different? I personally feel yes. First of all, if it was a male, then you already give that individual an intellectual status where you can start discussing things. Right now, the first questions that came in his mind is who is she? Whose is she? Where has she come from? Has she come here to create some kind of a union with me? Was she a spy and so on? That may not have been the case if it were a male sage that he was uh, thinking about. So, in a sense, what I feel is, and I also asked this question, did the exchange elucidate masculine aspiration versus feminine assertion? Yes. The entire episode can be interpreted as a performance of masculine authority enacted through the medium of a philosophical discourse to be demolished by the women, by the woman. And uh, the interesting part is that she succeeds in doing it. Now, friends, I mean, you have heard of many other dialogues that have taken place in Priyadaranya Upanishad between Maitreya and Yajnavalkya, Gargi and Yajnavalkya. If you read those dialogues in detail, you find that the last word rests with Yajnavalkya, not with the women. I mean, there have been many other Brahmavadinis also, but generally speaking, women do not have the last word. And here, clearly, she has the last word. And she has, in a sense, reversed, the typically male gaze and the idea of male intellectual dominance. She succeeds in doing that. And then comes my second query. Why? क्यों किया? भीष्म का स्टैंस क्या था इसके अंदर? भीष्म ने तो उसको बताना था कि मैं तुम्हें कहानी सुनाऊंगा जिससे तुमको इंस्पिरेशन मिलेगा. इसमें कहाँ इंस्पिरेशन उसको मिल रहा है? यहाँ पे तो एक लेडी ने डिफीट कर दिया है इन एन इंटेलेक्चुअल वे. Janak had failed to answer Sulabha's belief that sannyas or renunciation was essential to attain liberation, and Sulabha had humiliated him and had gone to the extent of saying that I'd come to test you, king, and I'm disappointed in you. Obviously, there seems to be some other hidden agenda in bringing about this particular episode. Generally, the most obvious question that would come to my mind is why should Bhishma seem to support her? What I mean by Bhishma here is the redactors, the writers. They're just using the character of Bhishma here. Support her when the tenor of the text overall of the Mahabharata is to support the pravritti mark. Pravritti mark is householder existence. That is, you can be a householder renouncer, one who does not give up his duties to pursue salvation. So, in that kind of a scenario, why was Bhishma and by logic the redactor supporting Sulabha, who decimated Jana and came across and went on saying that the path of renouncer is better in getting liberation than your pravritti mark, which also means that I also look at the larger picture. What I'm trying to understand is that does this episode actually have a political message? It's a challenge that is in the direction of the king. It is a gender challenge, it's a power challenge. And it is also a challenge for Yudhishthira, who's trying to get moksha while apparently pursuing this particular marg, that is pravritti marg against the so-called nivritti marg. Now, my personal submission is there, and I'll come to that point. What I personally feel that this particular episode has to be read in conjunction with another episode, which comes right in the beginning of Raj Dharma. This is, I think, in from 12 to Raj Dharma 12 to 19. That's the time when Yudhishthir is raising his liking for the Nivritti mark. He says, he's clearly, says that the war has ended. There's been so much of bloodshed. I will renounce. And that's the time he invokes the character of Janak. Very interestingly, again, he's invoking the character of Janak and says, look, long time back, you had this, ruler who had to you finally decided to renounce and go to forest. He gave up everything and went to forest in order to get his salvation. This he's telling Arjun, because he tells Arjun, you may be very good in the art of fighting, but you don't understand Sukshma Dharma. Basically, that I understand the complexity of Dharma and the deeper meaning of Dharma. You don't understand. So you let it be. Let me take my own stance here and let me renounce. In response to that, Arjun reminds Yudhishthir of what Janak's wife, that is a queen, did after he left for the forest. She followed him and lashed out at him for going into wilderness and leaving his dependents aghast. And then again a dialogue happens and he says, I can't carry on my duties and also try to get an inner liberation. So she then advises him to return and carry on his mundane duties like a karma yogi. The word is karma yogi, in a detached way, while practicing inner discipline, and promises that she is going to help him out in that. In the sense, you come back, discharge your duties, many things I'll take care of, but you have to do that. You are a karma yogi, and you can't just give up on your basic duties. And Janak finally returns. So when we juxtapose the two stories, what message do we get? The one in Raj Dharma alludes to the need to follow Pravritti Marg, while Sulabha's episode essentially punctures the king's attempts to do exactly that. So, did the latter episode subtly critique Kshatriya Dharma's Vairagya in the worldly mode format? My submission is precisely that the Bhishma episode was both accommodative and instructive. Accommodative enough to acknowledge that the women could have superior intellect. To that an extent, it is accommodative. But then it is supposed to warn Janak and kings like Janak, which means Yudhishthir, of making half-hearted attempts at containing arrogance and not practicing self-discipline. Because once he started doing that, Janak, he would go around telling, "Mujhe vairagya mil gaya hai, mujhe vairagya mil gaya hai." So he became very arrogant about it. He was not subtle about it. And those were half-hearted attempts. He was not really practicing self-discipline. So there was a plea for sharper discernment faculty. Nothing else can explain Bhishma's apparent paradoxical moves. His advice to Yudhishthira to detach himself from pain and rule the kingdom, and continue this, and at the same time also appreciate Sulabha for what she's saying. So, what was the whole idea? The entire idea at this point in time was you must follow, because Pravritti Marg is the tenor of the Mahabharata. The entire book is about that. But the book also accommodates diverse views. So Sulabha then is a representative of the other, the views that come from the Buddhistic traditions, non-Brahminical traditions, and Bhishma and Yudhishthir are then the voices of the Brahminical tradition trying to self-correct and also give advice to future kings. You may cultivate. Renunciation is something you can cultivate, but you can do that along with discharging your duties. The same idea comes in the Bhagavad Gita, Nishkam Karma. काम करो, निष्काम, कोई उसके ऊपर तुम don't invest it with any attempt to gain fruit out of it. Just discharge your duties, and you will attain inner emancipation. The same idea that you find in the Bhagavad Gita gets repeated here in the Mahabharata in a slightly different way. The whole discourse about pravritti nivritti mark does come up, but the interesting part about it is that it also addresses some important issues about the presence of women and the kind of gender relations that were being unfolded. Friends, we need to remember in the Buddhist tradition, you have the whole, you have a generation of Bak उपासिकास एंड भिक्खुनीज, द थेरीज, थेरी गाथा उन्होंने उसकी रचना करी है, जातक कहानियां वो घर घर जाके बताती होंगी. सो देयर आर important cases of mendicants moving around women and who convincing the populace about, some important philosophical merit. Sulabha probably is doing the same thing and warning the king of the same at the same time that if you will not remain very disciplined, if you're going to continue to be arrogant about what you're doing, your arguments or your purpose may get defeated. So this was a way, a story, an udaharan through which, in a very subtle way, a political message was going around to the ruler, to whom primarily Yudhishthir. Yudhishthir, you understand, if you have to cultivate that inner discipline. If you lack that, there is every possibility that you will be insulted, like Janak was insulted by Sulabha. So I would say it is simultaneously an essential, effective assessment of gender relations. Thank you.
So thank you very much, ma'am. I'm really grateful for your time. Now the floor is open for questions. You may raise your hand and I'll get back to you and ask you to unmute. Then you can move ahead with your question. Yes, Stuti,
Hello,
go
good
ahead.
evening, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I was actually interested to know what the immediate reaction of Bhishma was after this dialogue, because as you mentioned, that the writers called Sulabha's dialogue lovely, and they liked what she was saying, but Bhishma's objective seemed to be very counterintuitive to what her dialogue is. So, was he critical of Sulabha? Was he using her only as an instrument to show that, oh, this woman was taking Janaka away from what the main goal is? Or did he actually appreciate her?
As far as Bhishma is concerned, what the writer is saying or what Bhishma is saying is one and the same thing. Bhishma actually smiles at this. And at no point does he try to, after the story is told, kind of qualify the story. He does not do that. He smiles and the episode ends there. We are told the episode ends there, which means that he is actually supporting, in a way, Sulabha's argument and pushing, as you also answered it yourself, pushing Janak to think, why was he insulted? So he's pushing him to think. He recognizes the genius of Sulabha. So it's more like a strategy. It's a story, a strategy by which you're warning the king that you've become arrogant, you've become a little too content in your assertion that I've become a Vairagi, but in reality you are not. So it is a story tool for him to correct himself, basically by logic. Not Janaka's story is told to Yudhishthir that be careful. Once you tread on the path of householder renuncer, there is every possibility that you would lose your way in between. You have to continue with strong sense of self-discipline. The first reading of it, friends, would make it कि अरे वो तो support कर रहे हैं सुलभा को, वो एक्चुअली सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं सुलभा को, पर एक 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 पर्पस के साथ. सुलभा को सपोर्ट करने से वो जनक की कमी बता रहे हैं, और जनक की कमी किसको बता रहे हैं? युधिष्ठिर को, हु इज द वुड बी रूलर of now the entire Pandav empire. So if you want to attain sannyas and also discharge your duties, you have to be extremely, extremely disciplined. This is the message that is.
Thank you, ma'am. Next we have is Sambhav Jain. Go ahead with the question.
Has he written the question in chat box?
No, ma'am. Vanshika, you may go ahead with it.
Thank you, ma'am, for this talk. It was very insightful. Ma'am, though the authors of the text are appreciating Sulabha, but what in this way could we also interpret in this way that Bhishma is trying to say to convince or in some way that if you would not correct yourself or you would not follow this way, then even a woman could defeat you. Does it?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with it
Yeah.
completely. That if you, I mean, one, of course, is the pravritti mark point. The other is a clear gendered explanation that you will be fooled by a woman. Absolutely right. I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Amal Ranjan, go ahead with your question.
Thank you, ma'am, for this very interesting lecture. And as I'm studying this paper in this semester itself, it was very enlightening for me. And actually, I would like to ask a particular question that can we consider Janaka's attempt to sort of humiliate and, sexualize Sulabha's attempt to sort of challenge or dominate, can that be interpreted as a social reality of the time as well, which is deeply patriarchal and misogynistic in nature?
Yes, you are right. It is because it's very difficult. The very fact, Amal, that he's asking question, who are you, whose are you? He is still bound by that patriarchal mindset. He is. He's asking questions which are on which he has been socialized. So when he says that I'm free, this is exactly that she is asking, how are you free? You're not free. You're still bound by those set of questions. I have gone way ahead. You call yourself free. If I am free, you're still thinking that the kind of union that I am having with you is sexual union, when maximum what I'm trying to see is your inner self. I could not really get into such details right now because the paucity of time. If you get an opportunity to read the entire text, it's come out in English also. Apart from Ruth Vinita's Self is Not Gendered, we have Fitzgerald's work on it, which has come out. He's translated it in English also, and it's a very thick piece. Each and every line is there. I could not bring everything in, but she is very angry that you are talking to me as an ordinary man does. And here I thought of you of a philosopher came. So you are right. What you are saying is quite true. He's not been able to rid himself with the larger social milieu, the way he has been socialized.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Next wave is Vartika.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
First of all, thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful lecture, especially on the occasion of Teachers' Day, and a very happy Teachers' Day to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, I have a question regarding like when we compare texts like the Brahmanical text with other heterodox sect texts, whether Buddhists or Jainas or any other, what is your opinion on the position of women that has been talked about? Like whether heterodoxical texts give more importance to the voices of women in the society, or it's the Brahmanical ones? Like even the heterodox ones were like putting women down at some point of time, and even Brahmanical ones also don't treat women at par with men. So if we compare both the texts, which one is like provides a better voice to the women of the society? That's my question.
Well, I will not deny the fact, Vartika, that if you're taking the reference of the heterodox Buddhist text, primarily Buddhist, heterodox में क्योंकि जैन का literature का थोड़ा late आता है, I'll talk about it also in a moment. But by and large, the Buddhist texts do put women down. Even I mean, Jatakas ले लो या आप मतलब उनकी डिटेल्स में अगर हम जाते हैं तो वी गेट दैट काइंड ऑफ अ सेंस मोनास्टिक ट्रेडिशंस के बारे में जो बात होती है विनय पिटक में उसमें वी डेफिनेटली गेट अ सेंस ऑफ हायरार्की देयर बट हैविंग सेड दैट we also know even Buddha at one point in time was a radical reformer in his own way when it came to women, I would say his reformist zeal was a little circumscribed. But having said that, you see, he had the openness to acknowledge it when Ananda and Gautami went up to him, as the tradition says, and says that open up sanghas also for women. They are equally keen about it. He was worried. He was candid to say that a tradition that could have gone on for 1,000 years will only would get compressed only to 500 years. For the same reasons that we are talking about, primarily patriarchal reasons. But when they tried to convince him logically, he agreed. That is the reason, at least you have, with all the hierarchy there, you had a Sangha where women who wanted to leave homes and were allowed to leave homes could find an alternative existence. An entire tradition of Theri Gathas has come up as a result of it. So, between the two traditions, definitely Buddhism to start with was more liberal for women compared to it. But इधर आपके सामने ब्रह्मवादिनी या सुलभा का example है to challenge the idea that it's not only within Buddhist traditions, we also have that the same thing in the Brahminical traditions, but of a person who is pro nivritti art. That is one thing. So between the two. I should also give you that example, a very famous example of the Jain tradition in the 9th century. 9th century में आपने पता नहीं यापनीय सेक्ट के बारे में सुना है या नहीं. अदरवाइज जैन ट्रेडिशन जो है दिगंबर्स का तो काफी कंजर्वेटिव है. श्वेतांबरस डेफिनेटली ओपन अप होता है. बट एक यापनीय ट्रेडिशन है था 9th century में. There was a exponent by name of Shakatayan. He's considered, I consider him a feminist of a tall order in the 9th century. When he gets into a diatribe with the, I think it's Kundakunda, if I'm not mistaken, with the Digambar saint over the issue, why can't women attain liberation? स्त्री निर्वाण क्यों नहीं हो सकता है? तो वो बार बार एनाटॉमी को लेकर के आर्गुमेंट कर रहे हैं दिगंबर सेन कि उनका आई मीन दे मेंस्ट्रुएट एंड बहुत डिटेल में एनाटॉमी के बारे में बात करते हैं एंड दे go through childbirth. There are so many things. They will not have the intellectual capability of doing that. And he contests that. He says all other things are natural and do not challenge their ability to think. They have the right to Stri Moksha or Stri Nirvan. So within the realm of spirituality, we have this fine example of the Yapaniyas. Stri Moksha Prakaran करके एक text है जो attributed to Shakatayan of the Yapaniya sect, which is in south in the Karnataka का है शायद, if I'm not mistaken. It's such a fine treatise of telling that women also have equal capability and right. So right to emancipation, to nirvana. The word that is used is sometimes three moksha, sometimes three nirvana. So we do get isolated examples here and there of that. But by and large, the heterodox sect is definitely little more liberal compared to Brahminical. But Brahminical answer कर रहा है ना postmodern time में. सुलभा को लेकर आए हैं तो आंसर तो कर ही रहा है, ऐसी बात नहीं है. They have to represent their arguments.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Now next we have Sambhav again. I am asking you to unmute. Go ahead with the question.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask, in this case, we can see the social position of both Sulabha and Janaka is quite evident, you know. So, how do we get those characters? Because we also have to look at those who are absent in the text. So, how do we get those whose social standing is not that evident, or you know, it's somewhere hidden in between? So, how do we get that out of a text, as complicated as you know?
Because this particular dialogue is basically only between two. ठीक है, a context ये है. But at the same time, because it is the context of a court, so there is a possibility that there is also a queen around there. There's also a possibility that there are other women around there. In this particular dialogue, we are not able to locate the others very well. But that is why I told that juxtapose it to another dialogue, where Janak's wife becomes his teacher and says, you cannot just abdicate your throne, your responsibilities, come back. I will support you, but you will have to discharge your worldly duty and at the same time become a karma yogi and discipline yourself. So there are voices. There are times, friends, that you may not be, because this particular text is only about these two, but because it is in the setting of uh, of a court, we know that there could be answers, there could be others also, and that's precisely the reason why I took up the other text, to show that there are other women folk.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up is Chirag.
I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Thank you for this lecture and happy teachers day, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is how to define Vairagya? Like in general, we say Vairagya like is a man who leaves his house and lives in forest. But in both the cases, Janak had a wife and same Yudhishthir had a wife. Janak lived his life, he ruled, then how he can claim that he was a Vairagi? And same for Yudhishthir, he had a wife, he had children. Even the war was fought for his throne and like for this injustice to him. Then how he can claim that they both were Vairagis?
I think, Chirag, it was for this reason that I brought in the example of Bhagavad Gita, Nishkam Karma philosophy. Precisely for this reason, because if you were to read Bhagavad Gita, and they're exactly the same time, I mean, I'm talking about as texts almost the same time, the philosophy of the day is carry on with your duties with a sense of detachment. A sense of detachment. In fact, there's another text just before Moksha Dharma Parva, and that is the Apad Dharma Parva, and then it comes the beginning of Moksha Dharma Parva, where he's constantly telling Bhishma how unhappy he is of the, of the kind of problems that he's encountering as an individual, and Bhishma gets a sense of the fact that Yudhishthir is still reeling under a sense of guilt. You remember the whole story about half-truth of Drona, that Ashwathama mara gaya? And that is how the moment Drona hears, and then he says, Yudhishthir, tum mujhko batao. Agar tum bataoge, to main manunga. And so he says, Ashwathama mara gaya. फिर बोला धीरे से, मैं हाथी के बारे में बात कर रहा हूँ. इतना धीरे बोला गया कि वो नहीं सुनाई दिया और वो बैठ गया द्रोणा. He left fighting, and that is how Drishtadyumna kills him. Now that was a sense of guilt that he carried for a very long time. He is then also carrying the guilt of Karna being killed by them, who happened to be his elder brother, though he did not know about it, the bloodshed, all. So he's carrying that kind of a guilt that he needs to get absolved of, and that would come. Uh, uh, that kind of guilt that he has to be answered, he has to get out of that thing. So he's been told that, then he says that I want to, practice penance for that. तो उसको फिर सारे लोग कृष्ण व्यास भीष्म समझाते हैं कि वो पेनेंस तुम अंदरूनी तरीके से कर सकते हो. कैसे कर सकते हो? Do not enjoy what you are doing, but continue to do it. And in that sense, become Vairagi. We generally understand Vairagi as somebody who has left everything and taken to sannyas. No, he says that you will have to cultivate that sannyas within you. You do that. You do that by disciplining yourself, but continue with your duty. This is the basic idea of pravritti marg, which became very popular, which I personally say is a Brahminical response to Buddhist Jainas' call for renunciation. What the idea is, you can renounce within, you can renounce largely within the household setting. What is renunciation? Do not enjoy. Do not enjoy what, you may have loads of luxuries around. Do not enjoy that. But if you're a ruler, whatever your responsibility is, just discharge that. That is the final balance that we are talking about. And calling a person Vairagi while continuing with the duties. All duties have to be continued, and you're not going to enjoy the fruit of that. This is Vairagi.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we have the last question from the session. We are go ahead with that.
Good evening, ma'am, and a very happy Teachers' Day. Ma'am, I have a bit out of the context question, but I just want to know, who is this Janak? Is he the same person who was there in Ramayana, or is he someone who is the king of Mithila? So my question is, if he is someone who is the king of Mithila, but not the person who's same as who was in Ramayana. So how is it possible that all the kings of Mithila are the great philosophers?
That is exactly what I meant, Riya, that Janak becomes a prototype for a philosopher king. आप किसी को भी जनक, जैसे आप मनु बोलते हैं हम लोग, ये मनुस्मृति है, ये मनु ने लिखा है. आपको पता है कोई एक मनु ने नहीं लिखा है. इट्स अ वर्क ऑफ मल्टीपल ऑथरशिप. यू एंड आई नो, बट यू आर गिवन that the authors a certain title. So Janak is, some things are very clear. When you refer to Janak, he is the king of Videha or Mithila. ठीक है, ये तो इट्स अ फॉरगोन. जनक का मतलब ही है विदेह मिथिला के है. इसके बाद how the character of Janak is going to be used by the storyteller, the mythographers, the narrators may vary. But certain qualities about Janak would stay absolutely there, that he's very intelligent, he's very generous, he is a philosopher. You know, he sees Sita in the Ramayana. Sita is that child lying on the furrow in the field. He picks up that and the baby and adopts her, and then gives that fatherly love. So Janak is actually a reference to a philosopher king located somewhere in the east. इतना कुछ जैसे ना कैरेक्टर्स के कुछ प्रोटोटाइप्स बना दिए और वो हर जगह यूज किए जा सकते हैं. एक बार मिथिला में जब कहानी मिथिला की शुरू होगी, उसमें किंग जनक जरूर आएंगे, पर वो सेम जनक है, कभी लगता है सेम है, कभी लगता है नहीं है. तो जनक यहाँ पर, क्योंकि मैं शांति पर्व के जनक को कनेक्ट कर रही हूँ, वो तो स्टोरी में रिपीटेडली और कम कम डिस्टेंस पे आ रहे हैं. सो द पॉसिबिलिटी ऑफ द सेम जनक इज वेरी स्ट्रॉन्ग हियर. एंड अब आप देखिए, यू नो अबाउट द फैक्ट दैट there is Hanuman in Ramayana, and the Hanuman also comes in the Mahabharata. दोनों जगह आ जाते हैं. हनुमान वहां भी आते हैं, यहाँ पे भीम और हनुमान का एक इंटरेक्शन हो जाता है महाभारत में. तो बड़ा ये ना पॉपुलर फोक लोर है. इट्स लाइक अ कॉमन पूल. ऑल ऑफ अस आर फेमिलियर विद सम स्टोरीज. एक जनक राजा थे जो मिथिला के राजा थे, सबको पता. उधर से मैंने कुछ कुछ अपने ट्रोप्स पिकअप किए और मैंने एक और स्टोरी वीव कर दी. दिस इज हाउ इट यूज्ड टू हैपन, अ पार्ट ऑफ योर कल्चरल मेमोरी. सो इफ यू गो वेरी एम्पिरिकली टू फिगर इट आउट, अरे ये वही राजा है, ये तो हमको पता ही नहीं. एक्चुअली इन रियलिटी वी डोंट नो इफ देयर वाज अ किंग बाय नेम ऑफ जनक. Historically, objectively speaking, we are not sure about that. But he is a mythical king who's very pervasive in many texts.
And this is
Have
the
I
same
answered your
case.
question?
And this is the same case with Vasishtha also. He is
Most many
present in almost all the stories.
सब जगह पहुंच जाते हैं, बहुत सारे हो जाते हैं, ये आते ही हर जगह पहुंच जाते हैं. मतलब कई कई कैरेक्टर्स हैं, उनकी एक या दो क्वालिटी के साथ वो क्वालिफाई हो जाते हैं एंड कैन एंटर एनी स्टोरी. दिस इज द आर्ट ऑफ स्टोरी टेलिंग.
Yes. Yanshu, you may go ahead with your question.
Good evening, ma'am. For this one, thank you for this wonderful session. I have a very little question that you refer to different texts like Buddhist chains. So what are you thinking about other texts like in Muslim and especially Islamic texts? Are they talking about women empowerment, emancipation, or just like Hindu text?
Look, first of all, I'm not an expert in that area, so it would be unfair on my part to speak about it. But because I teach gender paper, I brought in the example of Razia Sultana precisely for this reason. आप रजिया सुल्तान के टेक्स्ट के एनालिसिस मिनच ने सबसे पहले लिखा है, उसके बाद आए अमीर खुसरो और फिर इस्लामी आए हैं. अमीर खुसरो का अगर आप डिटेल्स देखें about Razia Sultan, he seems to have got very enamored by her personality, the very fact that she unveiled herself. This is seen in a relatively positive light to start with, but as you get into details of his writing, he ends up saying that I don't want my daughter to follow Razia Sultan. She should not become the, a role model. Islami is fairly critical about it, but 16th century scholars can reflect back on Razia Sultan and say, you have sometimes your daughters as good as Razia Sultan, the sons are not as good. वो निखट्टू निकलते हैं, देखो ऐसी एक औरत, ऐसी एक बेटी भी हुई है. तो ये ना उसके बाद रजिया सुल्तान एक ट्रोप बन जाती है, और जब वो ट्रोप बन जाती है तो वो अपने अपने रेफरेंसेस में डिफरेंट तरीके से उसको यूज किया जाता है, डिफरेंट तरीके से यूज किया जाता है। अब उसी तरह से अगर आई डोंट नो मुस्लिम टेक्स्ट तो नहीं, मैं कहूँ प्रेमाख्यान्स में ले लीजिए। प्रेमाख्यान्स तो जो हिंदावी टेक्स्ट है, लिखा तो मोस्ट ऑफ द टाइम सूफी पीपल एसोसिएटेड विद सूफी लिटरेचर वालों ने ही लिखा है। उसके अंदर जब प्रेम की बात आती है, प्रीति की बात आती है, प्रेम नहीं प्रीति, द लव फॉर गॉड, तो सिंबोलिज्म तो विमेन के साथ ही आ जाता है। पद्मावत, पद्मावत को देखो उसके अंदर आ जाता है, फिर आ जाता है, चाहे वो हिंदू कैरेक्टर्स हो या मुस्लिम कैरेक्टर। व्हाट आई एम जस्ट ट्राइंग टू टेल यू इज much depends on who is using what, but the Sufi tellers use women as some of the women as reflection of purity. पद्मावत में तो प्योरिटी ही है। वो नागमती उसकी फर्स्ट वाइफ है जो जिसके साथ टेंशन है, बट एक सेंस ऑफ प्योरिटी के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं। तो मैं इस्लामिक टेक्स्ट या इस्लामिक तो वर्ड भी नहीं ठीक यहाँ पर होगा, आई वुड से दैट पर्शियन टेक्स्ट है, टर्किश टेक्स्ट है। I will have to be candid and say that I have not read them. I have very little knowledge about it. But I see that all around, all the societies are patriarchal. They're using women as a trope. Anyway, that is what I can see, by and large. Till women start writing themselves, there are men writing about women and for women. So there's a different way of looking at them. Sometimes a little more compassionate, concern. Other times, using them in a typical way. I mean, जैसे यहाँ पे उसने कहा दुष्ट है, विकेड है, वो तो ज्यादातर ये होता है all the problems men have they blame it on women. That I assume, I don't want to call it a universal truth, but I assume many texts would have it. But no, I will not be in a position to answer about the Persian Turkish texts. That would be unfair.
Okay. So thank you very much, ma'am. I have just a small question. What is the scope if somebody wants to go with the gender perspective in Mahabharata? So what is the scope of their research?
The Mahabharata.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
With
yeah,
gender
there is
perspective.
tremendous scope. Friends, I would like to tell you, gender perspective should not be just taken as perspective of women or on women. My own work deals with masculinity studies, and I am working on the Mahabharata precisely from a masculinist lens. अरे आपके पास 18 पर्व है, किसी को भी उठा के कर लीजिए, स्कोप ही स्कोप है उस पे काम करने का. And in Indian, I mean, if looking at the Indian literature, very limited work has been done so far. So in terms of seriously working on that, there is immense scope, immense. Now, I have just completed my work on the Shanti Parv, looking at the Kshatriya masculinity from that perspective. I don't mind taking up another text and look. I want to look at Anushasat Parv, क्योंकि शांति पर्व का जो एक liberal political view निकल के आता है, उससे काफी different अनुशासित पर्व में आता है when it comes to women and gender relations. So it could be different. But there are so many other parvas that you can take a look at. There's so many things. I mean, it is a bottomless ocean, the Mahabharata. And from a gender perspective, from the third gender perspective also, you'll have to study deeply, but references है. तृतीय प्रकृति पर तो है रेफरेंस किया जा सकता है. मतलब कन्फाइन मत करो सिर्फ विमेन के बारे में. अगर दूसरे तीसरे नजरिए से देखोगे तो जेंडर पे काफी चीजें और निकल आएंगी, और पावर रिलेशन पे देखोगे तो और निकल आएंगे. बस men and men vis-a-vis men. Like I've just completed, there's an article that would come out soon about the Nishadas. Eklavya का देख रहे हैं. Eklavya is a Nishada, and there the relationship between distant relationship between Arjun and Eklavya. It is also coming under the understanding of gender power relations. He wanted Eklavya to be removed if he wants to become the best archer in the world. So that's again a reference where the dimension of caste, at times class, also comes in. So now when we talk about gender, we talk about not just the issue of biology, anatomy. We're also looking at how this is located largely within the context of caste, class, ethnic groups. अमेरिकन हिस्ट्री रहे तो रेस वेस सब इसके अंदर आ जाता है. फिर तो बहुत ही वाइड हो चुका है ये. एंड महाभारत तो एक ऐसी किताब है, plunge the ocean. That is what I would say.
Okay. So So thank you very much, ma'am, for your time. Really grateful. And once again, happy Teachers Day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.